Hi, welcome to another episode of Swarajya Conversations. Today we have the author of Blinkers Off, Gauri Dwivedi. Now, for those who don't know, a lot of books on China come out every year. It's a good uh, subject to cover. It's a 1.4 billion people worth of subject to cover, but very little books come very close to covering every aspect of China, be it the BRI, be it the technology part of it, be it the economic warfare, be it the information warfare. And Gauri's book here, Blinkers Off, is one that you should really pick up if you're starting to understand what China is all about. For anyone who's been under the rock and not read about China so far, I strongly recommend this book, Blinkers Off. You can buy it on Amazon. And we have the author here, Gauri. Hi, Gauri.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Tushar.
Gauri, your book is essentially what I call a primer on China. For those who really do not understand China, that is where they should start. So I have to ask, what was the motivation to write this book? Because it just came out very recently, last year, in the end. After the pandemic, what was the motivation behind it?
Yes, thank you for that, Tushar. The book was intended to be a primer. It was intended to be available as a ready reckoner for those who wish to know more about China. For instance, a lot of us in our friend circle, acquaintances, or those who are policy makers, who are decision makers, may know about a particular subject, but not enough to be in a position to either decide or shape an opinion or effect some policy changes at a later point of time. So for those section of people in particular, I thought that this book, Blinkers Off, makes for a good start to understand just how significant is China as a challenge to the world. And as far as what really got me writing, well, I did make a few trips to China, and while I was there, I had several questions that came to mind. A lot of them, of course, went unanswered. And when you experience firsthand how does an authoritarian state function, you realize you tend to suddenly value your much criticized democratic values so much more. And that's when I realized that some of the basic questions around China have no answers, or not enough answers for a lot of people to understand. And that's how I started researching. And I started with a single question, which was just how much does China impact me as an individual? And then it became me as a country. And then it became the subcontinent, and so on. And the answers were overwhelming. And that's when I realized that it's important to jot this down, and put this in a framework that many people can understand just how significant is China for every country on the earth, and exactly why is it that what China is doing or Xi Jinping is doing impacts every one of us, including the very food that we eat on our table every day.
Gauri, there are two extremes. In March 2020, there was one extreme of people which said the pandemic would be the end of China, the world would boycott China, the Wuhan virus, as many used to call it back then. We've all even forgotten about Wuhan, it seems, at this point. But there was this one set of people on one extreme who used to say the pandemic would be the end of China. Countries would look to boycott China. They would want to hold it accountable, which has never happened. Supply chains would want to move out of China or at least diversify out of China. Then there was the other extreme, which thought that China would use the pandemic to further its Belt and Road Initiative, to further the economic warfare, to further the information warfare, to further the health road, they call it, the digital Silk Road, they call it, all those things. I was on the latter part of it. But 2 years after the pandemic, it's almost 2 years since Wuhan was locked down. 2 years after the pandemic, how do you see China's position in the world? Is it the first extreme, which believe that China would be held accountable and perhaps boycotted, or the other one?
Unfortunately, we are somewhere in the midst of either of these two extremes. And a lot of us felt that yes, maybe this would bring in the Wuhan virus, would bring in accountability that is much needed from a country as big as China. It hasn't happened, and I fear it won't happen. If in 2 years we haven't found out how the COVID virus started, we never will. And global agencies are complicit in not finding and not ensuring that the probe takes place the way it does. And as for the other factor, whether China will be able to successfully weaponize all the resources it has, it is trying to, but it may not succeed as much as it would have liked to. See, the ability to weaponize non military aspects of dominance lies in building that veneer of a benign superpower, of a superpower that is only pursuing trade opportunities, bilateral or multilateral trade opportunities. Once that veneer, once that mask is taken off, it is not easy to weaponize these non-military aspects of dominance. It wants to do, it will achieve some amount of success, as Australia pointed out, case of Australia pointed out, where it did weaponize its ability to import 75%, 60 to 75%, depending on variations of product categories, of Australian products. And when your largest importer decides to not do it or import one fine day, obviously there will be severe penal charges, and it was upwards of 3 billion for Australia. So those examples and those instances will be there, but they will be far and few in between. BRI will continue, but it will not continue at the feverish pace that it was continuing till now, or till 2020. Because countries will now evaluate with a fine tooth comb as to how much am I paying. For instance, Vietnam, it is now 10 years since its biggest road that was being built by BRI, under BRI, and now it is on the verge of falling into a debt trap, and it cannot start making those payments. Those instances will become more glaring, because now countries will evaluate that, this is not just about connectivity, this is not about identifying great trade routes and great trade opportunities and mutual benefits. It's much more than that. Now people and countries will seek those answers, and when those answers are being sought or will be sought, then certain aspects of accountability will be arrived at. And as far as BRI is concerned, later in the conversation, I'll give instances of just how much BRI has impacted countries, and how that larger conversation is now beginning to happen from Rome to Laos to Colombo to Belgrade and other areas.
Just a follow up question to this. The last 2 years, I mean, it's been a tremendous cost of life across the world, especially the United States, where they're still struggling with the virus. It doesn't seem that they ever had the virus in control. India still had its share of success with the virus, even with the Omicron wave. We can look back and say that largely we were successful in dealing with it. But tell me something, and correct me here if I'm wrong. Is it difficult to imagine a supply chain globally for any product, be it Apple, be it somewhat of your EVs, without China? Because even Apple has been very close to China. One of the rare successes of Tim Cook is his ability to handle China amidst the US China trade war. So, this one question really comes up every time, that maybe we are hoping for a bit too much when we say that we can imagine a global supply chain without China. So, how do you look at that?
No, it can't happen. It just can't happen, simply because it didn't build these supply chains overnight. It took 20 years, 2 decades, at least, very vigorously, since it entered China entered WTO in 2001. So 20 years of building deep supply chain networks cannot be either replicated or demolished or reduced overnight. That can't happen. But what can happen is, um, reducing levels of dependence. If that is achieved, then individual countries would be able to reduce their dependence on China. As a whole, global economy would continue to rely on China, but for specific segments, specific countries, if they are able to reduce their dependence, that will be a big arsenal up their sleeve against China. For instance, Japan imports an extraordinary amount of rare earth metals from China. And every time there is the Senkaku Islands issue flares up, the first thing China has done in the past is it stops the exports of rare earth metals. Now, Japan can't build anything from hybrid cars to name it to other areas because you need those rare earth metals which China has a monopoly over. So, if some of that dependence is reduced by Japan, it will be able to identify a greater amount of leeway in its foreign policy against China, which will be more effective and more long term. I think those areas will gain traction going forward.
But Gauri, to play the devil's advocate here, and you mentioned this in your book also, that countries need to have these bilateral trade agreements where they reduce dependence on China. But then you also look at the Wall Street, which has been lobbying in the White House not against China but for China. You have examples of so many companies, be it Apple, be it Mercedes, even the NBA for that matter, which all bend to the whims and fancies of China. Even Disney for that matter, a simple Hollywood conglomerate bends to the whims and fancies of China. So, at one point, it's correct to assume that we need to reduce our dependence on China, as you mentioned about Japan. But let's say the rare earth metals example I'll take. In the last 1 year, 2021, it was the first instance that rare earth metals had a supply chain problem too, that the prices went up too, the commodity prices went up. So over there, companies, even if countries want to reduce their dependence on China, there are companies like Goldman Sachs or Apple or Disney that are lobbying in the White House, for example, because they cannot cut their dependence on the big market China is. So, how do you balance these two situations where a country wants to cut its dependence on China, but a company wants China for its market?
That is the capitalists' interests completely and only aligned to their shareholders' interests and not to the nation's interests. That's been the extreme truth as far as American capitalism is concerned. And look at the irony. They all want to embrace China. They all romanticize that how China is going to give us even more profits and higher profits. And China thinks not even for a second when it decides that Jack Ma is not available. Jack Ma wasn't in public sight for a good
Yes.
4 months. All he made was one critical speech. So look at the ironical situations that we are talking about here. You want to go and embrace China and its Chinese capitalism with a socialism with capitalist characteristics, and on the other hand, you have how Xi Jinping or the Chinese apparatus as a whole deals with capitalists who they think cannot at any point of time become bigger than the country or bigger than the state. And this is where I don't think it can happen by coercion, because if it is coercion, then you pretty much end up following the state that you wish to not become, right? But it can be through a network and a combination of tax breaks. It can be through a combination of other policies which provide more favorable treatment to particular countries, or uh, pave the way for some of this to come back home. Domestic manufacturing again. Some of these countries in the last 2 years, like Singapore, like Japan, like Vietnam, have laid a great amount of emphasis on bringing some of these back, particularly Japan and Singapore. Vietnam is attracting investments. Japan and Singapore are wanting some of these investments to come back. Likewise, America is also trying to do that. So if those gain traction, then some of the capitalist tendencies can be tamed. They cannot be eliminated because, as I said, it's a free capitalist model, and these inherent ironies will continue to exist, but they will have to be reduced so they don't clash with the larger national or sovereign interests.
Perhaps it would be correct to say that if the Western capitalism greed did not exist, hypothetically, we wouldn't see China as we see it today. Would that be correct to assume?
How does one react to that? Because one wouldn't only say that it is Western greed. Also, a lot of things put together. It's a combination of so many things. But yes, I was reading about the exact time when Nixon went to China, and how those back channel communications happened, and then later on the other instance of how China was inducted into WTO. You're right. It is a creation of America, and it is a creation of American need to create a new virgin market for its goods. And one of the core reasons why Nixon went to China not just because he had certainly found some great love for the Great Wall of China, or the Shanghai countryside. None of that. It's because in the post World War II era, uh, American companies had invested and had a huge amount of increase in their capex spending, and after that they were straddled with excess capacity, so they needed a market. And because of the fact that the excess capacity was at a very high level, uh, they had a choice between China and India. And we all know why America chose China to develop and nurture as a large market, and not India. Those factors related to 1971, Yahya Khan. We all know that factors. The reason why Nixon was more comfortable with a Chow and Lai and not with an Indira Gandhi. So we know those factors. But having said that, you're right that at some level, Western capitalism has definitely created modern day China.
Okay, now coming to Xi Jinping, who just in October, November last year secured a third term, which makes him the leader for life for China. Now, this is huge. Now, compared to democracies where Joe Biden is not favored to win the 2024 presidential elections, he's not even favored to win the midterms. Xi Jinping is here for life. So, one, does it make him the most powerful leader on earth? That's my first question.
You know, I would have probably said a yes, very easily, or convincingly, when I was writing this book last year. But since then, the reason why I am a little skeptical is that the man who's the most powerful in the world would not choose to be holed up in his country on the pretext of ensuring that the pandemic stays under control. There's something that is playing on Xi Jinping's mind, whether it is the possibility of a coup, whether it is the possibility of not being able to have enough, positive voices on his side, or something that makes him a little skeptical about leaving his country. But yes, he is definitely one of the most influential people and leaders on earth. And when I say influence, I mean in so many aspects. He has economic, military, so many other aspects of influence, which right now that China has, that he's sitting over, that he is now going to exercise it. But as far as the Chinese politics is concerned, let me tell you that what Xi Jinping is really trying to do is, see, the general secretary of the Communist Party does not have a tenure. Okay, he doesn't sit only for 5 years. He can sit for as long as he wants to. And also the chair of the military commission also doesn't have a tenure. There also he can choose to be there longer. It is only the ceremonial titular head of the presidency which has a 5 year tenure that Deng Xiaoping put. And Deng Xiaoping put it because he was unhappy with his successor, Jiang Zemin. But apart from that, the real power, which is the Communist Party's head and the military commission's head, those two power centers do not have a tenure. So that Xi Jinping continues to be anyway. But the reason why the presidency is important is because you're the face of the country. You are the face who's talking to the world, and when you say something, your message has a much more weight, because you're also coming with the back of the army and the party. So to that effect, it's important. But let's also not underestimate the fact that the real power centers in China, or the Chinese politics, is essentially the CCP and the PLA, on which he can continue to sit on as long as he wishes to, or any other president would have wished to. The only point is that as far as his real uh, gravity of power is concerned within China, I think there are some uh, areas where Xi Jinping is worried. And maybe later on I can tell you that because a possibility of a coup did take place earlier, Xi Jinping is fearing that something similar may happen now, or maybe later in the year.
But talking of Xi Jinping a bit further, he has some domestic problems as of today. There is the unwinding real estate crisis, there is the slowing growth. The virus is no longer in control. We've heard of a lot of cities being locked up in the last week itself. The vaccine has not
Hmm.
worked. The whole uh, crackdown on private tech and industry last year also had its repercussions. So Xi Jinping has a lot of domestic challenges at his hand. But now securing a final third term, rather a long term, lifelong term, how do you view that? How do you view Xi Jinping from the lens of the Chinese, uh, from the Chinese population? If I were to ask it that way, like how does the Chinese population
Hmm.
view Xi Jinping? Let's forget the world for a moment. Just the Chinese population.
The Chinese population is going to be happy if the present economic prosperity that they feel, which their parents did not experience, if they continue to experience those, then they will probably be happy at she continuing for longer than the 10 years. Because let's face it, unfortunately, Chinese citizens do not have democratic freedom. They do not have those values that you and I cherish. And they do not have a free press. They do not have any of the freedom that most citizens on earth uh, have and take for granted, frankly. So for them, if the economic prosperity continues, then probably they will be okay with a she continuing for longer than the 10 years that it has been the norm. But the problem is the some of the other social issues that are now coming to light are probably going to be extremely tricky and difficult for Xi Jinping to handle. And these are, whether you take the factor that there is a serious demographic challenge that China faces,
Yes.
whether you take the fact that entertainers, uh, pop stars, movie stars, tennis stars are all being targeted, capitalists are being there's a crackdown on them. All these are specific areas of society where there is now a clear campaign to target and a clear campaign to silence, and those have a larger amplifying effect as far as the Chinese citizens are concerned. They may not directly be impacted if a Peng Shuai is not allowed to compete, or if she's not allowed to speak her mind, but it weighs on the larger psyche of the Chinese citizens. If their economic prosperity is also under threat, combining the two may become a larger challenge for Xi Jinping. So, if the economic prosperity of its citizens come down even one bit, some of the other aspects of crackdowns on the sectors I mentioned, putting them together will be a larger amplifying impact that Chinese citizens may stand up to. I don't use the word revolt because Chinese citizens know that the cost of revolt is very high, but I'm saying they may stand up to, and that standing up is what pop stars or movie stars and entertainers or even pianists can do, because they have a larger audience that they reach out to or can reach out to. They are the first starting points, or points where any possibility of a pushback can begin.
Before I go on to America and China, I would rather talk about Russia and China because you use this very interesting phrase in your book. You've devoted an entire chapter to it, the power of compounding. And for America, the challenge, Americans, there's in America also, there's like two extremes. One who still see the sole enemy in Russia and the ones who see it in China. Trump was on the latter side, which was a refreshing change. But coming to Russia and China, you use the phrase power of compounding, that these two countries have shared interests, that these two countries have a shared agenda. Can you elaborate on that?
Hmm. And we are seeing that in Kazakhstan also, right? I mean, we are seeing how China is very pro to how Russia has been dealing with Kazakhstan and the whole unrest that it has happened there, and how China is, of course, backing the Russian led forces. See, the point is, Russia and China, their leaders have one primary objective, which is to undermine everything that America stands for. And by extension, that will include what some of the other allies of and friends of America will be, which is your Japan and India and stuff. So anything that undermines what America stands for is going to get a vote from both Russia and China. And their leaders, particularly, are heavily invested in ensuring that their brand of governance shines out as compared to the Western values or the democratic values. So every time you have an unfortunate incident that took place last year at Capitol Hill, or the very unruly the farmer protest that took place in India. Every time such instances happen, you have the Chinese propaganda machinery or the Russian propaganda machinery saying, "Hail the Chinese model, hail the Russian model," because this is part of their agenda to ensure and tell the world that what we are doing is far superior than what these folks are trying to do. So we've got it right, and because we've got it right, our model works better. And to do that, they need to come together even more than what they did in the past. Of course, there will be friction between the personalities of the two leaders, because whatever said and done, Putin will not be able to accept or digest that his economic power is a quarter or maybe less of what the power that Xi Jinping has. He runs a sub $2 trillion economy, 1.7, whereas that of China is much bigger. But nothing happens by numbers alone, because our economy is bigger than Russia, but the geopolitical might that Russia has is far more than its economic might,
You
right?
make this important.
But
Okay.
yeah, yes, please go ahead.
You
Yes.
make this important point about geopolitical might, and I noticed in the chapter where you spoke about the Belt and Road Initiative in the Middle East, you mentioned how China
Hmm.
used Russia's geopolitical legacy in the region and its own economic muscle to further its cause in the Middle East. So, how do you see the evolving of the relationship between Russia and China, so over the last 30 years since the fall of the USSR? Because for China, the fall of USSR was an important lesson. That combined with the Gulf War and the Tiananmen Square fiasco, these three events is what people say actually made China what it is today. What we see in Xi Jinping is the
Hmm.
culmination of the lessons from these three events. So, if you have to look at China and Russia, how do you think their relationship has evolved in the sense where they both benefit each other? One is, of course, the agenda peddling, but other is more about the geopolitical aspect of it. Say, in on the side of Japan, in the Eastern Pacific, and all those things. So, how do you look at that?
See, both China and Russia, when their interests are aligned, they know at some point of time, if any military friction arises, will they be willing to back each other's backs completely? I don't know. But that messaging will be sent out loud and clear. I remember the first time when this whole quad thing was really being shaped up, and it was really taking up a final shape post 2017, after the COVID outbreak in the last 1 year.
Hmm.
I saw some articles that were saying that if you add up China and Russia, it competes with quad nations. It is even better than what the quad nations put together are. See, this is subtle messaging, but it is meant to point out very clearly that what, if these two guys come together, or if we come together, then we can definitely ensure that how we want the Indo-Pacific to remain, it remains. There's a reason why Russia says exactly what China wants when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. That there is no quad, none of that happens. There is a reason why Russia is going around, bashing quad. So, of course, when it comes to some sort of a military tie-up, if they come together, there will be a huge amplifying effect. I don't know if they will, because that also means you can't go back from taking such drastic measures. But the one place, and I'm glad you pointed out, was where I see that the two countries will come together, not the Indo Pacific, but the Middle East. Because, and West Asia, because that is where I believe they will be able to cause a huge amount of change in the power equations. And it doesn't even require rolling up of military tanks and submarines like in the Indo Pacific. You don't need to do any of that. But how they are being able to topple the power balance, you can see that in country after country. Iran is a very important country that you pointed out, and how Iran goes impacts both India as well as America. So China is impacting two of its main adversaries with some change in position in one particular country. So what China can provide is funds. What Russia can provide are its deep legacy networks. Russia is a significant player in this region. It has always been so, and its legacy networks come in handy the moment you marry it to China's ability to write large checks. And it is important to point out that Chinese BRI programs and investments are in those areas, in those sectors which are at the backbone of any economy, whether it is your core rail networks, whether it is your core power systems, main telecom networks. All these are the backbone of any country. And if you are able to sort of handle them and manage them and have the ability to make changes or hurt or impact networks, then you're really running a country, aren't you? And that's what China's larger objective, unfortunately, with BRI is. So it's not just a connectivity program, and that is where the focus has been in the Middle East. It is making huge amount of investments in Saudi, in UAE, in Iran, in Israel. In Israel, it has made deep investments, so much so that America had to tell Benjamin Netanyahu that make sure that these investments stop, because you're allowing all critical investments to come in
Hmm.
from China. So in those areas, as I said, it doesn't require rolling of military tanks like it does on the Ladakh border. It doesn't require coming out with your frigates and corvettes like the Indo-Pacific requires. So Middle East is just a combination of realignment of geopolitical strategies, more so because right now in the Biden administration, Tushar, there is this fear, or there is this focus, rather not fear but focus, that unless we dive further deeper into Indo-Pacific, we'll not be able to counter China. And even if it means stepping back from Middle East, then so be it. Even if you say that, even if you want to do that, you can't turn around and make those statements. Unfortunately, that's what some of those statements have been made by the Biden administration, and they have of course been exploited fully by both China and Russia.
Now, coming to America and China, the elephant in the room, in the geopolitical room. See, I could be wrong. People could disagree with me, but I think Donald Trump was very, very important with all his faults, where he pointed out how China had taken the WTO for a ride. You have clearly mentioned in your book how WTO has been taken for a ride by China, that even while being the second largest economy of the world, it classifies itself as a developing nation. So a Venezuela or a Vietnam get the same treatment in the WTO as a China gets. So from that point of view, and you've also mentioned about the tariffs in your book, which is a very important point again. And this is where I see some success of President Donald Trump, where he had the tariffs in place, where he had these mandatory buyouts by China, mandatory imports from America by China. But all that has somehow fallen apart under the Biden administration. Now, one, the trade war hasn't worked.
Mhm.
Two, the sanctions are working perhaps for a company like Huawei or ZTE, but at the end, China is also pursuing its own goals. And three, on Taiwan. So America and China have a lot of point of contentions. But how do you see the relationship evolving? Will it be mutual coexistence? Because that's what a lot of people in the White House are stressing, that we have to pursue mutual coexistence, understanding the disagreements, and agreeing on what we can. That was the key of the summit, also the online summit they two had very recently, Biden and Xi Jinping. So how do you see the evolving relationship between America and China? And mind you, there is also a possibility that a Republican president
Hmm.
might come back in 24, and that could very well be Donald Trump. So there is a lot of how do I put it, a lot of suspense within this thriller. So how do you see the relationship between the two countries?
So, important question with several threads to it. One is that as far as Biden's popularity is concerned, there was a research report going into the elections that said that Trump was far more popular in the Indo-Pacific or in the Asian countries against Biden, because he had a far more muscular and stronger approach towards dealing with China. It obviously was completely opposite in America, where Biden was more popular. So there's a reason to believe that many Asian countries were happy with Trump's approach and were expecting it to lead to larger results in his second term. So that expectation obviously is probably why those numbers were what they were. Now, as far as the trade aspect is concerned, Biden administration has separated its trade relations with China with its other geopolitical relations, whether it is Taiwan or whether it is some of the other aspects of the Quad or the Indo-Pacific and so on. Uh, so, on the Taiwan aspect, it's important to highlight that Joe Biden did categorically say that America is committed to the status quo. That's important because that sends out a very clear and a strong message that America will back Taiwan. Remember, as far as the law is concerned, the law only says the TRA, which says that America is only going to give arms and supply arms to Taiwan. Um, that's it. It doesn't say anything more because it's not recognized. But a positioning like this is important from Joe Biden's aspect and his tenure. Now let's come to the trade aspect, where yes, there is a very different approach as compared to what it was under Trump's regime. Trump felt that you can use your trade deficit as a leverage, and I think that's very important to understand because it's only countries who run a deficit against China that have the ability to leverage it, like India, like America. You know, uh, if you have a surplus against China, like Australia, you unfortunately have no bargaining power. It is when you run a deficit that you have a bargaining power. And I think that America needs to realize and needs to be able to leverage better than what it has done so in the past. Because, you like it or you don't, the trade war did force China to come on the negotiating table. It did force China to at least make some committed purchases. Uh, they didn't happen because the COVID pandemic hit, and of course, things didn't work out. But the committed purchases aspect came into being only as a consequence of the trade war. So, to that effect, trade deficits that countries have against China can be leveraged better if there is a willingness to do so.
But again, if I talk about the trade war in retrospect, in hindsight, we have this benefit. A lot of analysis show that the trade war, one, it did not do anything significant for the Americans except that it got China to the negotiating table and it hurt consumers more in America than in China. Now, with this aspect, how much do you think that tariffs can really work? Of course, you can have China with the compulsory buyout, with the compulsory imports to reduce that deficit. But how do you go about the tariffs part of it, especially from an American point of view, which has its market
See,
entirely dependent on the manufacturing in China?
there are only two, three ways in which you can de-risk your dependence on China or American dependence on China. One is you start, onshoring. Some of that has happened. I was going through some data that in the last 1.5 years, American companies have come back. Some of them have come back. So, some amount of onshoring is important. Some amount of diversification of supply chains outside of China to nearby destinations. Whether it is a Singapore or a Vietnam or a Japan or in India is something that companies need to identify. And whichever country offers enrolls the red carpet manages to welcome the foreign investor. So that is the second aspect of diversification of supply chains. And the third aspect is to be able to ensure a level playing field from China. No country can compete with China simply because of its massive subsidy giving machinery. China gives 17% as rebate to exporters. No country can ever compete because nobody can give these kind of heavy subsidies. Of course there are varying categories, and there are several segments, but the broad theme is that China gives or heavily subsidizes its exporters, and because no other liberal capitalist economic model allows that to happen, there is no way you can compete with it. So the other, and you obviously can't go back to the WTO because WTO as a machinery is defunct. So either you renegotiate your bilateral trade pact better, or you rely on some of the other aspects of building a more uh, balanced ecosystem, which cannot happen in the immediate term. It obviously will happen in the medium term or the long term. In that duration, the capitalists' interests in Wall Street will have a huge bearing on Capitol Hill. That's an answer that Americans need to find for themselves. That how will their version of democratic values only take care of capitalist interests, or will it also address some of the larger threats that they are facing?
It's interesting you bring that up because now, if you look at the Chinese companies, what we saw happened with the tax company called Didi in China, they no longer need the New York Stock Exchange. So that whole variable interest entity model is also starting to collapse. Now the Chinese want companies to list themselves, so the American money to come, but on the listings of Shanghai or of Hong Kong. So how do you view this? That in the future, will more Chinese companies be on the listings of Shanghai and Hong Kong and not on New York? And will the American money still pour in? Because for a lot of American funds, it's actually the Chinese money, Chinese companies they want to put their money in. So how do you look at that?
Hmm. So, yes, Chinese companies wanted earlier to come to Wall Street, and after the crackdown last year, there's a very clear message that has come in that you can't do so. And the reason for that is they don't want that the company's bosses to be, FCC and not CCP, right? They did not want that the Federal Commission should be the one, should be monitoring the
Hmm.
companies and not the Chinese Communist Party. So, having said that, I don't see a lot of them coming to US anymore. And my sense is that as the third term begins, if the third term begins of Xi Jinping as planned, then Hong Kong as a market and Hong Kong as a huge capitalist trading hub will lose its shine, because then the clampdowns will become more significant and more severe. The reason why she is not doing it right now is because he wants to ease into his third term, and then Hong Kong will happen in a larger way. So the moment that starts happening, then capital will not flow in the way it was flowing earlier. So even Hong Kong listings will not be as rosy and as desirable as they are right now for mainland Chinese companies. It just can't be, because mainland Chinese companies want that they are able to get all the money from Hong Kong and get all global capital from Hong Kong. But that changes the moment you change the complexion and climate of Hong Kong politics. And that will happen in the third term of Xi Jinping. As far as Shanghai is concerned, unfortunately, mainland companies, Chinese companies, they are looking Shanghai as a huge destination to raise capital. That is not going to happen, because Shanghai will not attract global capital the way Hong Kong does, and that is not going to change in the near future. As far as American funds chasing Chinese companies, that will continue. That is a trend that will not change, because one also needs to understand that China is a large economy. Everything about China is at a very, very significant scale. So uh, for instance, if let's say Audi had a great year in India, and it sold a huge increase in its number of cars. It sold about, if my memory serves me right, about 3,500 cars in India, but it sold upwards of 100,000 cars in China. So it's also a $14 trillion economy growing at 6%. So, one needs to keep those aspects in mind, so one cannot be blind to the prospect of making money in
It's
China.
interesting you
So,
bring this up.
Chinese fund,
It's interesting you
yeah.
bring this up because I was speaking to an automobile manufacturer, someone working with the Jaguars, and they told me that for
Hmm,
Jaguar, which is owned by Tata, Chinese New Year orders are very, very important. So for people who say that we
hmm.
can simply discard China because of whatever reasons, that the point you make about Audi is very, very important. That a good year in India might be equivalent to a bad year in China. So that's the
Hmm.
metric we need to keep in check, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, of course. As I said, funds cannot stop investing in China. The only thing that they will probably do is reduce their exposure, and that will happen only due to increased political pressures and political uncertainties. And I see that happening in the third
Hmm.
term. If that third term happens for Xi Jinping, because that's where the clampdowns will start becoming more significant and severe, and the first impact will, of course, be in the capital flight, first in Hong Kong and then probably in mainland China. But you cannot take away the prospect of consumer companies making money in China, simply because there's a large consumer base there. So that will not stop, and that cannot stop. And and frankly, we should not look at it from that way either, because the idea is not that China as an economy collapses or China as a society collapses. Our objective or the view should only be towards Chinese CCP's desires to own the world should collapse. That is what should be the focus of the world. And to that effect, ensuring more regulations on some of the other areas that I said will bring in those changes.
That's a very very important statement that you make, that we shouldn't wish for the collapse of the Chinese economy, but the collapse of this CCP dream to take over the world. That's a very important point. Now, coming to the India and China equation, it's only gone downhill since the pandemic. Not that it was in the best scenario before the pandemic. We had the Topium standoff. We've had the issues on the LAC going on for a while now. But since Galoan, the relationship has only gone downhill. Now, I have two, three questions regarding it, and you can take them point by point. One, from a military point, how big a challenge is China for India on the land? Because you mentioned about the Quad in your book, and you say that America and India need to work together. America sees a challenge in China on the sea, in the Indo-Pacific, whereas India sees it on the land, on the Himalayan border. So, how big a military challenge is for India? The whole Chinese, the PLA and everything. First point is that.
See, Tushar, the challenge is real. Let's not be ostrich approached in our mindset that the Chinese challenge is something that is only insignificant, minuscule, or only up to a certain point. No, the Chinese, we like it or not, play to a certain game
Hmm.
plan, and they have a slightly more long term vision as far as India and the entire region that they covet is concerned. uh, they also know that India is the only counterweight to them in the region. Japan is not a counterweight. As I said, economic size has nothing to do with geopolitical size. Japan's economy is twice of India, but does it have two times of India's geopolitical might?
No.
No. So India is the only counter to China in the entire region, in the entire Asian region. I say Indo-Pacific, land, everything. Whether you talk about on sea in the Indo-Pacific or on land in the entire Asian continent. So, which is why they will continue the effort to make repeated ingress into Indian territory. This process is now not going to stop, more so because, as I said, if Xi Jinping gets a third term, it will be based on certain clear aspects. The muscular approach towards the Chinese dream. Nobody knows what is this Chinese dream that Xi Jinping has been talking about since 2013. But that Chinese dream somehow has Ladakh in it, in some aspects, is my interpretation of it. Because, otherwise nobody knows what is this Chinese dream. So to that effect, the repeated ingress into Indian territory will now be a regular phenomena as far as China is concerned. So, to that effect, the challenge is real. Also, one needs to keep in mind that in the last 2 years, since the Galwan, it's going to be 2 years now, the infrastructure development in the area has been at a very significant pace from the Chinese side. We've responded. We've had our own infrastructure approach and upgrades that have taken place. Atal Tunnel and everything. They are very important. But we need to be mindful of the scale at which the Chinese envisage the infrastructure to be in that region. And if we are able to keep that in mind, I believe then our response will be even more strong, long lasting, and with a clear message to China now and later. And when I say China, I say the CCP, the PLA. The Chinese citizens unfortunately are clueless about what's really happening. They only have the Global Times editorials to go by. But beyond that, this messaging will come in about how serious we are in terms of our territory and how much of an exception we take to Chinese ingress into our territory.
Now, the second question is, and this came in an Economic Times report yesterday only, that because of the law that came in last year about the countries sharing a land border with India, the proposals for investments into Indian companies would have to go through the government. So that whole bureaucratic red tape resulted in a deadlock of sorts where proposals worth $6 billion were stuck. Now, there are rumors that the government is considering to do away with it for investments up to 10% in a company. Now, my question is, can the Indian companies let go of the Chinese money? See, there is one part is the investments, the other part is the free money that comes in the form of advertisements, like the Vivo was coming in for the IPL, for example. Now, can the Indian companies dodge Chinese money in the medium and the long term? And if yes, at what cost? What would be the other side to it?
Mm. No, they should not let go. No funds should be let go of. But this in terms of screening, around the world, screening is taking place. Europe has started screening Chinese investments. Israel has started doing so. America also started doing so. It had its own model of screening. So, screening of Chinese investments is taking place and should continue. Why should India not
Hmm,
screen the investments coming in from China?
hmm,
That doesn't mean that we are not asking them to come. We are not we are being unwelcoming of funds that are coming in,
hmm,
but we are being very clear of how that money is being deployed, who will use that money, and most importantly, how will that money affect India's core national interests. And I think that is something that around the world countries are doing. As I pointed out, US, EU, everybody is now screening Chinese investments because they are wary. When large amount of investments start coming into a port city like Venice, Europe is worried.
hmm,
When large amounts of Chinese money is coming into Greece, and turning it into a propaganda machinery for Beijing, the world is worried. EU is worried. Likewise, you have the American system of screening funds. So that should happen. And I believe that's a very important message that goes out to China, that, what, we like your money. We want you to come and invest. We are an open economy. We're not going to hold our capitalists accountable just the way you do. And, they'll not disappear like how it happens in your country. But that doesn't mean we are not going to keep our checks and balances in place because we don't trust the color of your money. It's as simple as that.
Now I'll come to the final three questions. The first is about the investments. You said that they are being screened in every country now. Now, the world has had this perception of the Belt and Road Initiative that it's only to take the physical assets of a country, the infrastructure, the railways, the strategic ports. In Israel, you mentioned a very important point that a port owned by the Chinese company has come up in the vicinity of a port which is operated by the American Navy. You mentioned that in your book. So is it perhaps 2022? We are in 2022. BRI has been on for more than a decade now. Perhaps BRI has matured. The investments have been made. Now the investments would only be strategic. If I look at Africa, South America, the big investments have been made, and the takeovers will now be only imminent because of the defaulting on the loans. But now going forward, we need to view BRI differently, say from two perspectives. One, the strategic takeovers that happen due to defaulting of the loans, and two, investments in the strategic sectors, say in the rare earth metal sector in Africa. So how should we view the Belt and Road Initiative going forward?
So, Belt and Road Initiative is going to see three changes, in my opinion, going forward. One is that those countries where there will be defaults, there will not be immediate and easy strategic transfers. I believe there will be now a push to hand them over to multilateral institutions, multilateral
Hmm,
frameworks. The idea is that you cannot just allow a Chinese takeover of important, influential strategic infrastructure. And I'm going to come back to why China invests on BRI and what really is it in a second. But first, this question. The second is that apart from multilateral takeovers, the second aspect that will happen in BRI is that there will be now focus on areas of future warfare, which is going to be digital,
hmm,
which is going to be your space, which is going to be your Arctic region. Those are the regions which will dominate future conflicts or future possible areas of conflicts. And that is where China is going to invest more on. And also because there, the concept of strategic takeover and all those will be far less obvious, and will not create the kind of narrative that is now worked in the last couple of years against China. So that's my second assessment, that how BRI is now going to reshape. And the third point is that there will now be specific geographies that China will target even more than what it was earlier, because that will mean that it's further entrenching its position of dominance, and that will be the Indo-Pacific. It will now look further and further cementing its area in the Indo-Pacific, and not possibly venturing out so much into Latin America as it did in the past, where it's one of the largest investors in Venezuela, or one of those things. It is now going to restrict and focus itself on Indo-Pacific, to prove to America and to the other world powers that, what, this is now essentially my area of dominance. That's how I think China is going to revisit the whole BRI concept going forward. And the one thing I want to add on BRI, Tushar, is that what has changed is people and countries now know what they are signing up on. BRIs, for it's supposed to be a long term project finance, and it is meant to have projects which have a gestation period of 30 years and 40 years. Nobody builds a power station overnight, or a train network overnight. But despite that, there are two things that BRI projects have. One is payout start after 10 years, which is grossly unfair for the recipient country, because no large scale infrastructure can start paying from the 11th year onwards. The second thing is that the rate of interest is on an average 4.2%. 4.2% for long term project finance is probably 10 times, 15 times of what some of the other countries like Japan provide. So but that data now, what countries have as a tool to imagine and decide whether they want to be part of this machinery and this big project anymore or not.
Now, the penultimate question, you mentioned the Indo Pacific. We have to talk about the Quad. Australia has suffered the brunt of economic warfare. Their imports were stopped to China, and China is the biggest importer from a trade perspective from Australia when it comes to their beef, their wine, everything. And they all were put at a halt because Australia wanted an inquiry into the origins of the Wuhan virus. India has suffered with China. Japan has its own problems with China. America has its own problems with China. But even then, Gauri, Quad doesn't come across, even today, after 2 years of the pandemic, after the trade war, after Galwan, after the whole trouble in the East China Sea, even then, Quad doesn't come up as an organization that can really counter China. Where do you see the weakness in the Quad, and what really should the Quad evolve into in this decade, at least? Say, if you have to imagine the Quad in 2030, what do you think it should be like to effectively blunt China's emergence?
Which is, it should be able to create alternate supply chains. Tushar, that alone can bring serious damage to China and its economic power, which is at the backbone of its entire geopolitical ambition. If that is blunted, then that itself will mean that China's Communist Party's ambitions are stunted. As I said, we don't want China to not rise. We just don't want those ambitions of ruling the world to not rise. And for that, if alternate supply lanes, the chains are built, then that will do it. And secondly, some of the other countries, the ASEAN countries, they should be made as Quad Plus members. That hasn't happened because they work as a cohesive unit, and they all have direct links with China. And they also are, of course, direct maritime neighbors of China. They've borne the brunt of the island building and everything. But Quad Plus should be out in terms of an evolved concept, and that should include the interests, sovereign, economic, not military maybe, because as I said, because the ASEAN neighbors have their own inhibitions against China, but some of the other ambitions, objectives, and interests of these ASEAN countries should be married into, or should be taken on board for the Quad to become an even more effective entity against China.
How do you imagine the role of smaller countries, say like a Philippines in the Quad, or say a South Korea? Now, both South Korea and Japan need China to counter the North Korean threat. We know that. But how do you see the role of the smaller countries, say like a Sri Lanka? Can it ever be a part of the Quad after its experience with the BRI? Philippines, which has been doing it up and down between America and China, they're still figuring out which side to be on. Or say a South Korea, how do you view the role of these smaller countries, Maldives, for instance, within the Quad? Do they have a place in the Quad, and how that can these smaller countries be very useful in blunting the Chinese emergence?
No, I don't think they can formally be part of a Quad alliance because A, their exposure to China is significant, and B, they are at the receiving end of Chinese aggression in the past. So they don't want to invite more of Chinese aggression or, the ire of the CCP or the Coast Guard. They don't want any of that. So they may not formally join the Quad, but some of their other interests can be taken into or can be given some more importance, which is, a lot of times Sri Lankans turn around and say, you know what, we want funds. And, at that time, only China was signing those checks. So we just decided to take them. It's a very simplistic assessment of what happened. We all know that. But the crux of the problem is that there are economic requirements of smaller countries, the IOR littorals, as you call them, and they need to be addressed either by India or by India plus Japan or India, Japan, US, or the Blue Dot Network. Some of them have to be addressed. And when they start getting addressed, then the compulsion to reach out to Chinese checks would reduce. And also, it would put pressure on some of the corrupt politicians who've taken on these Chinese checks. That will also reduce, and that has been the single common trait in all or most of the last BRI investments, whether it is the Hungarian Prime Minister or the Greek Prime Minister or the Sri Lankan Prime Minister. They all accepted Chinese checks with no riders whatsoever, and without reading the fine print, because of now there is proof and investigation of serious lack of ethical standards. And those corrupt practices now come back to haunt these countries when sovereign assets are at risk. But to solve some of those issues, Quad can realign with the Blue Dot network that America has, and it has to look beyond just project governance and standards. It needs to evolve into a counter to BRI. The moment there is an effective alternative to large scale project finance, then BRI will lose its charm with many of these countries. And to that effect, Quad itself will become a serious counter to China's ambitions.
The final question, Taiwan. Now, you mentioned that the law says that Americans would only supply arms to Taiwan. They wouldn't directly participate in the conflict. And the way I see it, I don't see Americans entering into the Taiwan Strait without an exit strategy. And that exit strategy would firstly want them to be there for at least 20 years. We look how Americans are still there in the Korean Peninsula. Where do you see Taiwan's future by 2030? Would it be invaded? Is it the invasion of Taiwan imminent? And what consequences would it have on the global supply chain given 50% of our semiconductors are coming out of TSMC? How do you look at that?
Wonderful question, Tushar. When you talk about Taiwan's future as and in the status quo that it wants to maintain that. I would assume by 2030 it would be increasingly difficult to maintain this status quo because by then, if Xi Jinping is still there, if I keep using the word if during the entire conversation, but if he is there or if his successor is there, a large part of his legacy would be centered around reunification with Taiwan. Remember, some of the other leaders, Mao did Tibet. Mao ensured that Tibet happened. Why we signed the Panchil Agreement is a separate conversation, which we needn't have right now. But Mao's legacy was also Tibet. Likewise, Deng Xiaoping's legacy was also Macau and Hong Kong. Apart from the SEZs, it was Hong Kong, Macau. So for Xi Jinping, it has to be something in the same league, and that comes back to Taiwan. So it would be very difficult to envisage a scenario where the status quo would be easy to maintain as it is right now. To imagine that the status quo would be the way it is right now 8 years hence, the chances of that are lesser. I don't say they are not there, but the chances are lesser. And to that effect, the supply chains, in my sense, in 8 years would be replicated in some part. And I strongly believe that that is where India will play a very important role. I think there is now a realization that semiconductor supply chains is where India can play a huge role globally. And after that acceptance, I am very positive and hopeful that it will happen. 8 years is long enough for some amount of ecosystem of semiconductors to take shape. It's a very capital intensive, water intensive, significant industry, but in 8 years, that ecosystem will begin to shape up. And if it does, and I think that is where India would probably cement its role in the world, not just as a counter to China, but as a big heavyweight in one of the most crucial sectors in the world. And I think that is probably going to be its defining moment going forward.
Well, thank you, Gauri. That was a very elaborate and very enlightening conversation. And to our audiences, I strongly
Thank you.
recommend the book Blinkers Off. Of course, there were a lot of topics we couldn't cover because of the paucity of time, but I strongly, strongly urge you to get this book. The review would be up on Swarajya's website over the weekend. So I do recommend that you read that as well. But for those who want to get started on China, to understand what China means to our world as a whole, to our lives as a whole, to the global trade, to the global geopolitics, I recommend Gauri Dwivedi's book, Blinkers Off. Thank you, Gauri.
Thank you so much, Tushar. Thank you so much. This was a lovely conversation.
Thank you.